here heard me deliver this lecture before. I've given it twice before. I want to make sure that I can put in some nice new tidbits to make sure that you're stimulated in case you're familiar with the material already. Anybody? No? Oh, goody. That means everybody here is new to the subject. I would like to ask you to hold your questions till the end. Once I get into the flow, I'm going to be delivering a lot of information, much of which will probably trigger some things in your head. Things you're like, oh, I didn't know that, or wow, I'd like to really know more about that. Please hold that till the end of the talk, and then hopefully we can have some robust discussion, because I'm also going to not just be delivering some history that you may have not been aware before, but also furnishing some interpretation. So off we go. Son of Enfield, father of Texas, a bottom-up view of the life of Elisha Marshall Pease, 1812 to 1883. And this is a picture of Governor Pease. By the way, this is when he was alive, 1812 to 1883. And this is a picture of Governor Pease when he was in his late 40s, early 50s. Why is this man important? Well, he's an important figure in the history of Texas, first of all, for the following reasons. He was a two-term governor of the state in the 1850s, and he was provisional governor of Texas during Reconstruction. He was a member of the early Texas legislature during the early statehood period, and he served 2 terms in the House and 1 in the Senate. He's the first comptroller in the history of Texas. He is unusually, I might say, a founding member of both the Democratic and the Republican Party of Texas. Something that today probably wouldn't be possible. He was a leading force in the funding and establishment of Texas public education. Many of you are probably aware of this. He was a key framer of the 1836 Constitution. I'll have a lot more to say about that. He was the primary author of the Texas Criminal Code. That code lasted a long time. It was in force until the early 1970s. He was, in conjunction with this, a key figure in the establishment of the walls of the Texas prison system and its funding via convict leasing, something which has grown in influence and stature since Pease established it. And as a capstone to his career politically, he was collector of customs for the port of Galveston in the late 1870s. Here's a picture of Woodlawn, the famous Pease mansion, which leads me then as a gateway into a discussion of why this man is important for the history of Austin. So let's go through some of that real quickly. First of all, he owned a lot of land here. After he finished his time in the legislature and became governor, he bought a lot of land, much of which later would be known as the Brackenridge Tract. These were part of Pease's extensive land holdings. His descendants established the neighborhood called Old Enfield. You all are familiar with this neighborhood, I imagine? Yes? Those of you who are all y'all from this area, from Central Texas? Okay, anybody not from here? Like, wouldn't know? Okay. Where are you from, sir? California. Oh, this is going to be good. I love that. So, well, I mean, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. And he was the original, I talk about the Brackenridge Tract in this slide right here, originally part of the Pease's family. This was a plantation that he had established. And Old Enfield was established by R. Graham Niles, his grandson, who started a company called the Enfield Realty and Home Building Company, one of Austin's original 20th century real estate speculation firms. Now, Enfield, what does that refer to? And that's right, it refers to Pease's hometown in north central Connecticut. I probably should mention at this stage that I too am from Enfield, Connecticut, and know the history of this man in ways that probably most of you don't. I grew up with much of his legacy from our standpoint back in Connecticut to a certain extent. He was the local boy made good in Texas. I never quite understood why in junior high school I was made to read stories by O. Henry. There was this mysterious figure who had left Enfield at some point and gone to Texas and done something. That's kind of how he was presented during high school years. And then he did some other things that are important in Austin. He was, along with George Brackenridge, founder of the First National Bank of Austin in 1874. Lots of investments in cattle and railroads. Railroads very important in the post-Reconstruction era. Abner Cook designed that building on the corner of 6th and Congress, which is a famous building. And Abner Cook, of course, was also the architect of the governor's mansion and of this structure here, Woodlawn. Pease was very involved in business activity after Reconstruction, trusts, water, gas, all kinds of things. He was part of the consortium that built the first bridge across the Colorado River. And there are a lot of things in Austin and in the state of Texas that bear Governor Pease's imprimatur. Pease Park. You all know about Pease Park? Pease Park is the first public park in Texas, 1875. And there's a plaque there that commemorates this. Pease Elementary School. You all know about that one? There's a plaque there too that explains what that is about, and it's the oldest school in Texas, still in continuous operation. Pease Elementary, a very desirable school for people to attend. It's an open enrollment school. There's no geographic area for it. Pease Road. And then there's this thing called Pease Place. Any of y'all seen this thing on Enfield Road? There it is, Pease Place. A blend of tradition, comfort, and sustainability. Why am I putting this slide up here? Well, it's to convey to you that in Austin real estate, the name Pease conveys a lot of things, which the developers of this property lay out here. A blend of tradition, comfort, and sustainability. Old Enfield is part of a historic district now, the Old West Austin Historic District, which was entered into the National Register of Historic Places in 2003. And this neighborhood has some of the highest real estate valuations in our city, which matters. Which matters if you're going to be a person developing real estate along these lines here. Look at some of these green amenities here. I'm actually going to do a little advertising for the developers. 100% LED lighting. They have a PV system on the roof. There's tankless water heaters there. They have a really tight thermal envelope. There's all kinds of passive solar in the structures. And they have electric elevators and so forth and so on. In any case, the point here is that this name, Pease, is very important in the history of Austin and of Texas for a variety of reasons. Let's talk about Pease's enslaved people. The Pease plantation, which formed the basis of what I described earlier as much of the Brackenridge tract, also, of course, had enslaved people on it. And the descendants of those enslaved people would go on to found the neighborhood in Austin known as Clarksville. And you can see the plaque for Clarksville right here. The slave cabins for this plantation were about a mile, a little bit less than a mile away from Woodlawn, which is the big house. This is the plantation big house. It was a working plantation, but it was not a plantation on the scale of plantations in East Texas. For instance, plantations in Brazoria County or Fort Bend County or in Harrison County and so forth. Pease, during the Civil War, was a Unionist, and during the Civil War spent much of his time at Woodlawn with his family and slaves. I'll have a lot more to say about that. Clarksville itself is named for Charles Clark, who was able to acquire the land in the early 1870s from Governor Pease and established the neighborhood. Charles Clark was not from Austin. There's not real clarity on exactly how and when he got here. Bottom line is that he's the founder of the neighborhood that now bears his name. And then in the 1970s began an effort on the part of the city and the county and other authorities essentially to gentrify the area, which is what has happened since. There are some things related to the Clarksville neighborhood that are still around that predate the gentrification of it, such as Sweet Home Baptist Church and other landmarks that are in the neighborhood. But there are very few black people anymore that live in Clarksville, although many go to Sweet Home Baptist Church for service on both Saturday and Sunday. So now let me talk then briefly about what I hope you will take away from what I'm going to talk about in my lecture. The first thing I want to impress upon you is the importance in the history of Texas of settlers from New York and New England to the history and culture and politics of this state. Lone Star Yankees is what these people are sometimes called. I've given you some names here: Asheville Smith, William Marsh Rice. Rice, of course, has a university named after him in Houston. Rice was from Springfield, Massachusetts, which is just north of Enfield. Charles Morgan from Connecticut. Ashbel Smith from Connecticut. Anson Jones. Who was Anson Jones? Last president of the Republic of Texas. He's from Connecticut. Helen Chapman. And this is a picture of Helen Chapman right here. This is a book of her letters called The News from Brownsville. Where was she from? Massachusetts. And then, of course, the Bushes. First, of course, George H.W. Bush, and then George W. Bush, and many others. Now, what are some things that distinguish these Yankees that came here from people who came here who predominated with their gone to Texas wagons who were coming here from Alabama and Tennessee? Well, by and large, they were better educated, among other things. But what they also saw, especially Helen Chapman, is they saw the Texas frontier, and that is what it was for much of the 19th century. It was a frontier. It was particularly difficult for women and children. And when you read this book and read Helen Chapman's letters back to her family in Massachusetts, her husband was a soldier serving in South Texas, in Brownsville and Corpus Christi. What she describes is a harsh, unforgiving, desolate landscape. Now, what did these Yankees do in their time on the stage of 19th century Texas history? Well, as I hope you'll see as I continue with my discussion, is that they established many of the city and the state's charitable, educational, and religious institutions, as well as many of its political institutions and infrastructure. Austin, being eventually the seat of government of the state of Texas, has therefore benefited most of all from this northern Yankee influence. You can see this all over the place, not just in place names and other sorts of things, but in the differences between the state's institutions of higher education and other institutions. Texas A&M is what? They're the farmers' college. They're the oil workers' college, right? For people living close to the land. It's a more southern institution. That's why it's in the SEC now. Okay? The University of Texas, that's the school for the liberal arts and humanities, social sciences people, right? A direct Yankee influence, I'm going to argue, and not just because we're here on the campus of the University of Texas. Let me briefly talk about what the authors of these two books here distinguish between what they call urban versus market entrepreneurs. This book, Power, Money, and the People, A Brief History of Austin, which at the time was still pretty noteworthy, distinguishes between what he calls market entrepreneurs and urban entrepreneurs. Urban entrepreneurs are people such as EMPs. They were people who were interested in progressive growth that helped to establish modern institutions, which later found expression in the early to mid-20th century in the coalition headed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, Tom Miller, Alvin Wirtz, and others, who used federal money to grow Austin in pretty incredible ways that have set the stage for what Austin is doing now. These are people who had a devotion to a sense of place, what we would today call the environment. They believed in what I contend is a fundamentally northern political philosophy of progressivism and active government. Is everybody with me when I say with what I'm talking about so far? I hope so. Now, contrast that with a more fundamentally conservative Southern agrarian philosophy born of Thomas Jefferson, the yeoman, gentleman, farmer whose ambition when he hitched his wagon in Alabama or Tennessee and came here was to do what? Become a planter. Own slaves, own some land, and basically be left alone. Okay? These people fundamentally did not and do not believe in active government. They view in many ways government as the enemy. They hate taxation, and their conception of the public good is fundamentally different. These are competing trends in the history of Austin and of Texas. Now, that said, you can stretch this thing too far. 19th century progressive thought differed a lot from its 20th century counterpart. I'll have something to say about that later. So let's do a brief biography then of E.M. Pease. He was born on January 3rd, 1812, in what was then the village of Enfield, Connecticut, to two people. Lorraine Thompson Pease and Sarah Marshall. He was the second of 7 children. L.T. Pease, and you can see a picture of him at the Austin History Center, a portrait, was a character, one of those iconic New England figures. He was a restless soul, worked as a lawyer, prospector, farmer, teacher, merchant, politician. And he also wrote one of the first written histories, academic American histories of Texas and of Latin America, South America, and Mexico, which was published in 1837. During E.M. Pease's first trip to Texas, he came here with his father. Now, E.M. Pease's great-grandfather has a distinguished lineage as well. He was one of the co-founders of the town of Enfield in 1682. The settlers of Enfield came to this part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the late 17th century from Salem, Massachusetts. And we all know what Salem is famous for, of course. As a consequence, Enfield has a strong religious history. The family name goes back to England. You can trace it all the way back to like 1300. There's requests and this sort of stuff. But the bottom line is that the history here is a fundamentally New England Puritan history. And that was the educational background that Pease had. He was educated in the Puritan tradition. He eventually moved to Hartford. Hartford, of course, is the capital of Connecticut in 1829. And he obtained a clerkship in the post office under John Milton Niles. Now, Niles is a name that matters a lot in Austin, too. There are place names in Austin named Niles. Right? This is the Niles that we're talking about, John Milton Niles. Niles was a strong Jacksonian Democrat. Jacksonian Democrat, Andrew Jackson. Okay? And he was appointed postmaster by President Jackson. Niles and L.T. Pease were close friends, and Niles married Naomi Marshall, Sarah's sister. E.M. Pease would then marry their daughter in 1850 after he had come to Texas and after he had served in the Texas legislature. He became familiar as a result of these associations with a lot of influential Democrats. Gideon Welles, who would later on become Secretary of the Navy during the Civil War. And this is what sparked his interest in politics. Why did Pease come to Texas? Well, he says so in his letters. And what he says is, I had a strong desire then to try a new country. Not necessarily an unfamiliar sentiment. Texas and the possibilities of Texas had been advertised all over the United States, particularly in the New England press, and particularly in papers such as the Hartford Courant. Hartford Courant is one of the oldest newspapers in America, of course. Why is that? Well, Stephen Austin, who was the leader of the Texas cause in the mid-1830s, it's not commonly recognized where his family connections lie, where his family roots lie. And they lie in the state of Connecticut. Yes, that's right. They lie in the state of Connecticut. Now, of course, Stephen Austin, born in Virginia, right? That's where his father, Moses Austin, was, who did a lot of different things, including engaging in slave trading. They ended up in Spanish Missouri, but from Missouri they ended up in Texas. But the family lineage prior to Virginia lies in New England, in Connecticut. So, wanting to try a new country then, E.M. Pease decides in 1834, at the age of 21, he is going to leave the comforts of home and he's going to head to places west. What is Enfield and where is Enfield? Well, let me show you real quickly. Enfield is right up here along the Connecticut River. This is part of Hartford County. This is Hartford County right here. For those of you over here. Over here, along the Connecticut River runs through the state, essentially access the state. And this is a map of Enfield. You can see Connecticut is about 5,500 square miles, which is pretty tiny compared to Texas, which is 262,400 square miles. Travis County is 1/5 the size of the entire state of Connecticut. Now, what was Enfield at the 1820 and 1830 census? It really was a village. It had a population of only 2,000 people, including 23 people of color. By this point, Connecticut was in the process of gradual abolition of slavery. And the 1830 census does not list any returns for Enfield, but it does provide a count for Hartford County, and the count was about 51,000 people. By the way, if you go to the cemetery, this is Enfield Street Cemetery. Enfield Street at Enfield is Route 5. Here it's called Enfield Road, but in Connecticut it's Enfield Street. Route 5 is a north-south street that you can take if you want to cross the border into Springfield and places beyond, into the Pioneer Valley. Now, Pease had some ideas about what it would take to succeed, and here's what he said. This Western country is the field for lawyers. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new here, right? The old joke about, the frontier town is, there's not a problem when there's one lawyer. The problems start happening when the second lawyer starts moving into town, all right? So that's why you had a lot of lawyers coming here. Now, of course, being a lawyer in a frontier place like Texas, which was its own country, was an entirely different proposition. I mean, were there law schools at the time? What would it take to become a lawyer in those days? Okay? Pease recognized this. He said they are well paid and if economical can soon get rich. And Pease worked his way west. Of course, he did the New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois route. While he was essentially traveling, observing things, and trying to figure out where he could economically prosper the best, he met other opportunistic Americans who wanted to try places such as Texas, which was encouraging people from the United States to come. They read Mary Austin Holly's book about Texas, which extolled the virtues of Texas soil and the limitless business opportunities of the place. And eventually, Pease met this person here, Carlos Barrett. That's not his name is Carlos Barrett, native of Vermont, who was emigrating to Texas to establish a new law practice. And in 1835, Pease and Barrett concluded, and he was a fellow New Englander from Vermont, they concluded an agreement to travel to Texas, to Mexican Texas, together. They left New Orleans on the steamer San Felipe, and they ended up in one of the leading ports in Texas of that time, Velasco. And that's when Pease arrived, in Brazoria County, which is where Velasco was. Now, initially, though, Pease worked his way inland and was part of the Bastrop settlement in the county of Mena. He did some things there. He speculated in some land. He got some land from the Mena municipality for some basic legal work that he did in 1835. But things were really in flux in Texas at that time. By that point, relations between the central government in Mexico City, the regional government in Saltillo, and the Texas government were, they were basically in tatters, and mumblings were well about that there was going to be a movement for independence on the part of the Texas colonists, almost all of whom were Anglo, and many of whom had not been in Texas for a long time at all. They were new arrivals like Pease. That they were going to try to separate the Texas province from the Mexican federal government. Pease threw his hat in with those people. He joined the rebellion against Mexico. And he eventually played a significant administrative role in the formation of the new government. He was the chief clerk for the provisional government. He was a co-author of the Texas Constitution. He was acting secretary of the Treasury. I mean, keep in mind, this is a young man in his early 20s who'd been in Texas for weeks. He was the first controller of the public accounts in April 1837. And after independence was secured, he decided to relocate his law practice, his fledgling operations, to the economic heart and center of Texas, which was Brazoria County. Now, Pease got really, really lucky when he moved to Brazoria County, because who were his patrons and his chief clients? They were the Mills brothers, okay? Robert and D.G. Mills, otherwise known as the Dukes of Brazoria. They were the largest slaveholders and planters in Texas by far. They had vast interests in real estate, shipping, plantation agriculture, merchandise, transportation. In those days, it was really about two types of speculative activity that were financial resources. And we have ample documentation of this. We have mortgages being written. We have insurance policies being taken out on two items. One was real estate, which in Texas at that time was all but free for the taking. The real valuable thing that constituted a huge chunk of the net financial assets of these people was their enslaved property, their slaves. They were financial instruments just like real estate is today. It's called real estate speculation. In those days, when you could own another person as human property, it was called Negro speculation. Negro speculation. Now, Pease, he devotes himself fully to the interests of his new clients. That's why he came to Texas. He essentially is a boy, young man, making good. He devotes himself fully to his law practice. We don't have a lot of correspondence from him in these early years between 1830 and 1845. In the few letters that we do have, Pease tells his family that he had more legal work than he could handle, and that his business prospects kept him, quote, constantly occupied. In February 1841, Pease wrote his father that, quote, in the practice of law in this country, a man cannot retain his business unless he devotes himself to it entirely. By 1841, Pease was being solicited to run for Congress. Now, Congress, we're speaking here about the Congress of the Republic of Texas. But Pease turned down these initial early entreaties because it would interfere with his business concerns. Quote, my only ambition is to secure an independence, and as I know that is in my power, I do not intend to let considerations divert me from it. And tellingly, what he says is this: I have secured some property. If my business continues as it is now, in 4 or 5 years more, I shall perhaps be rich. Now, I already discussed some of the transactions that his firm performed. Much of this had to do with land and with enslaved people. But there were also other things, standard things such as probate, debt cancellations, agriculture, and so forth. And Pease ultimately realizes his dreams of financial success. The 1838 tax roll of Brazoria County shows that he owned 270 acres and 11 town lots. And his law firm owns 1 lot. By 1841, Pease owned 200 acres of land and 41 town lots, and the law firm 3,687 acres and 5 town lots. And in 1845, Pease paid property tax on 2,776 acres and 19 town lots, with the firm paying for 4,401 acres. He also owned 11 slaves. Pease was a strong supporter of the annexation of Texas to the United States. 1845, of course, is the year when this was accomplished. After considerable wrangling and debate, both within the United States Congress and in Texas. After this was accomplished, he ran for a seat from Brazoria County and served in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd legislature. He then ran for governor in 1851 and lost. But he ran again 2 years later and was reelected in 1855. So let's briefly then talk about Governor Pease's tenure, his initial tenure in those 4 years that he was governor. He's generally regarded as one of the better governors in Texas history from the standpoint of fiscal management in particular. Remember, this was a Jacksonian Democrat at that time. And Jacksonian Democrats are really, really fiscally conservative. Those of you who know your American history know that Andrew Jackson despised Wall Street. He had a famous barbecue in the White House, where he invited the common man to come in, and they came in and destroyed things, much to the mortification of the Washington elite. So Pease inherited this fiscal conservatism, and Texas, which had been perpetually in debt from the beginning of Anglo settlement, began to achieve some modicum of financial stability under Governor Pease. He also was a pioneering supporter of public education at every level. Public education in Texas really begins with EMPs, particularly the education of groups such as the deaf. The Texas School for the Deaf on South Congress Avenue is what? One of the legacies of EMPs. Why? Why would a guy like EMPs care about a group such as what was then known as the deaf, dumb, and sometimes blind? Well, we have an institution of higher education in the United States that is the oldest institution of higher education, or really education at every level, for the deaf. Anybody know what it is? No, it's not Gallaudet. Gallaudet is in Washington, D.C., right? And it's named for Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, a famous educator of the deaf who brought a Frenchman named Laurent Clair to Connecticut to establish the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. Okay. Now, Pease, of course, personally wrote or oversaw the generation of many laws, particularly criminal law, probate law, and the country here, it's actually the county court system. He initiated and supervised the construction of many public buildings, the General Land Office, that building now that's used as the tourist center in the Capitol area. That's something that Pease initiated. And then, of course, the governor's mansion itself, which I mentioned already. And Pease used creative financing to settle the state's debt. Now, in retrospect, it seems obvious. What he did at the time in negotiating an agreement with the federal government is that he was able, that land, of course, was going to be transferred, much of it, to federal control. And Pease was able to negotiate an agreement with the federal government where the federal government would assume Texas's debt, thereby bringing Texas's balance sheet back down to zero. Now, let's talk briefly about a connection with, again, Connecticut that's not often mentioned. This is John Milton Niles. I've already mentioned him to you. The annexation of Texas to the United States was very controversial. The revolutionaries wanted it to happen in 1836. It didn't happen. Why? Slavery. Abolitionists from northern states, led by people such as John Quincy Adams, the former president, didn't want it to happen. They felt that it would tip the balance of the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states in Congress and elsewhere. So Texas then went its own way for 9 years and was its own country for 9 years. Not the only state, by the way, to be its own country. I know some Texans don't want to hear that, but it's true. In 1843, President John Tyler came out in support of annexation. He entered negotiations with the Republic of Texas and its Secretary of State, and a treaty eventually was ratified. The problem is this. It was defeated 16 to 35, well below the 2/3 majority necessary for ratification, right? Our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States says what? In order for the United States to merge or accept another country into its territory, that can only be done via a treaty. And according to the Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate must approve that for that to be enacted into law. Now, James Polk, a Democrat, and a strong supporter of the manifest destiny of territorial expansion, was elected president in November of 1844, and this was going to be something that he was going to do. I mean, the election of 1844, manifest destiny was one of the things that election was about. So when he got elected, he felt he had a mandate to accomplish the annexation of Texas. So something was worked out where another state was entered into the Union to balance the entry of Texas. And that state ended up being Oregon. The Oregon Territory and Texas were adopted into the United States via joint resolution. What's a joint resolution? A joint resolution is an internal declaration by the Congress of the United States that can be enacted via simple majority, 50%, right? 50% plus one. It's not a treaty. A treaty is something that's negotiated between two parties, okay? But, it was the time of, that's the way it was back then. By the way, this approach was used later on to acquire Hawaii. The Texas precedent was used explicitly to bring Hawaii into the United States. But who was the person in the Senate who put this over the top and got Texas annexed to the United States? It was E.M. Pease's father-in-law. Okay? From Connecticut. That's how close this vote was. Now, let's move on to the pre-Civil War years. And in discussing this is kind of like the golden age of slavery in Texas, more or less, the years between 1845 and 1861. Fundamental issues more or less had been settled to the Texans' satisfaction. The institutions of government were fully Southern. Texas was a slave-holding state with a Southern-style aristocracy. But again, what made Texas a little bit different is it had this Northern element of people like Pease, which is really what's so fascinating here. So then, if we want to have a conversation or learn a little bit more about Texas in these years, it's good to read some other accounts of other travelers, Canadians, and in this case, a German. Wilhelm Steinert is his name. He came to Texas in 1849 in the wake of the European revolutions of 1848. Which were, of course, that was a very turbulent time in Europe. And there was quite a bit of German out-migration to places in the United States, including Texas. Steinert was sent here by more or less a cooperative in the Berlin area to scout out Texas. And he went and saw some of the earlier settlers in Texas and so forth. But here's what he wrote. And this was published in the original German, but it was translated about 10, 15 years ago into this book, North America, particularly Texas, in the year 1849, a travel account. And here's what he says. He says, in your dealings with Texans of American extraction, you must take care not to provoke them. The consequence might be a bullet in your head, and nobody would take any notice of it. You have to be especially careful in talking about slavery. If you do not restrain yourself from commenting on this subject too freely, you can get into unpleasant quarrels. This is freedom of speech in Texas. The least insult provokes the bloodiest revenge. This incident, by the way, did happen to him. He's relating an incident that actually happened to him in San Antonio. Okay? You all know about this book here, Texas Tough? Anybody read this book? Published about 3-4 years ago. In discussing some of the economic and cultural differences between these competing northern and southern trends in the making of Texas, let's talk briefly about the southern culture of honor that the author of this book, Robert Perkins, talks about. Raised in a culture of dominion, white men in Texas and other southern states came to place an unusually high premium on personal valor and patriarchal respect, whereas the merchant-friendly value of restraint held sway in the north. A chivalric code prevailed in the South. A cult of honor took hold. Honor became a people's theology, a set of prescriptions endowed with an almost sacred symbolism. And you can see this exist well into the 20th century. Movies such as Gone with the Wind, The Southern Gentleman, and these kinds of things. According to honor's strictures, manly self-assurance and martial daring earned community esteem, whereas any public slight invited violent retaliation. Honor. The result was an extraordinary prevalence of male violence, not only between master and slave, but among whites themselves. Dueling, feuds, lynching, and public executions all developed with greater intensity in the South, as did everyday homicides, which have occurred with more frequency in the South for as long as records have been kept. So let's talk a little bit about the Civil War then, having set the stage for this. Of course, a seminal event in American history and in the history of Texas. Texas was spared much of the fighting. Federal troops were scarce, but it was still a violent place, mainly because it was a frontier society. It was political violence that predominated in Texas. You had loyalty oaths and other demonstrations that you were expected to participate in. This is something with deep roots in slavery. You had this self-appointed master class. You were, if you were a gentleman of property, you owned slaves, you had to participate in the slave patrol in order to discipline your fellow planters to make sure that things weren't getting out of hand. If you refused to swear allegiance to the Southern way of life after Texas seceded from the Union, you faced serious consequences, such as the Battle of the Nueces or the Nueces Massacre. You also had vigilante killings in all kinds of counties in Texas. There were plenty of people in Texas who were not enamored with the idea of having to be conscripted into the Confederate Army, especially since the Confederate Conscription Act exempted men who owned at least 20 slaves. The North did the same thing, by the way, just in a different way. The most obvious, the lesson here is basically why. There's a book titled called Rich Man's War, Poor Man's Fight. That's kind of the lesson. The most obvious consequence of the war was emancipation. The population of bondspeople in Texas swelled during the war. Slave owners brought or shipped their human property to Texas to prevent their seizure or escape to advancing federal forces. As a result, you had 250,000 African Americans in Texas by the mid-1860s. So let's take a look at the 1860 census and returning back to EMPs. This is a picture of the actual schedule of EMPs. This is EMPs right here. That's what this says. Okay. The 1860 census lists Pease as the owner of 10 slaves, 6 males and 4 females, aged 9 to 55. Pease, his position on this issue of the Civil War and secession was substantially similar to Sam Houston's. Now, Sam Houston was a Southern man from Virginia. He was a little bit different in some of his attitudes, but politically, for the most part, Houston was the leader of this faction, of which Pease was also a member, that said that it was absolute crazy talk for these people in places like Texas to secede from the United States when you could have basically everything you wanted within the context of the United States. Remember, what was at issue was not slavery. That was not on the table in 1860 and 1861, right? The election of Abraham Lincoln, which was one of the main reasons why secession came, was about what? It was about the expansion of slavery to the western states. Lincoln had already promised, had already guaranteed Southern slaveholders, you can keep every single slave that you have in the places where you are. This was not considered, though, enough or acceptable to Southern hotheads. So secession comes. Sam Houston loses. He's removed from office. And people who would not swear a loyalty oath to the new Confederate government found themselves oppressed to a certain extent. Even elite people such as EMPs, who was a former governor. He seriously considered leaving Texas and moving back to New England. Another branch of the family had established some property and some fame in Wisconsin, in the state of Wisconsin. But Pease didn't really think too long and hard about leaving. He looked at his extensive land holdings, among other things, and the 20-plus years that he had spent in Texas, establishing himself and his family in the Lone Star State. And he decided he's not going to leave. He's going to stay in his estate at Woodlawn, and he's going to tough it out. Okay? Now, Travis County famously, I have this here. Have any of y'all seen the vote, the 1861 vote for secession of Texas from the United States? Famously, if you look at some maps, Travis County is one of those few counties that did not vote to secede in the vote in February of 1861. Right? Any of y'all familiar with that? Most counties in Texas overwhelmingly voted, and the overall vote to secede was overwhelming. Texas was in the first group of states to secede from the United States after South Carolina did. But my point is that by August of 1861, it didn't really matter. The Southern Code of Honor dictated that once the decision was made, you went. And many Austinites were now supporters of the Confederacy. Pease would not swear the Confederate loyalty oath. As a consequence, he lost his license to practice law. The new legal system was the Confederate legal system. And he would not swear an oath to that system. So his stuff, the stuff that he had done as a lawyer, became null and void. So what happened? He's hanging around his mansion, and he decides to farm alongside his slaves, more or less. Now that said, the Pease family in Texas, although these years were lean and they had to, mend their own clothes, Lucavia, his wife, wrote a bunch of letters to family members in New England and elsewhere saying that, we're living comfortably, we just had to kind of get rid of some luxuries that we were accustomed to. That was not the state of affairs in other parts of the country. So we can't say that Pease, the Pease family had it super hard, but from the standard that he was accustomed to, it was a shift. So now let's move on then through the Civil War. I think we know the outcome of that one. And move on to Reconstruction. Who's this? Anybody? No. That's Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president. Right? Now, Reconstruction is probably the most misunderstood and demagogued period in American history. You could really make the case that the Civil War wasn't from 1861 to 1865. It really lasted from 1861 to 1876, which is what most people consider to be the end of Reconstruction. The long and short of Reconstruction and the Civil War is basically this. The North won the war, the South won the peace. And that persists to the present. This is Andrew Johnson, who became, after Lincoln died, president. Now, Johnson, like Jackson, President Jackson, was from Tennessee. And he was a strong states' rights advocate. He was also, like a lot of people at that time, a raving drunk. And he was in charge of a period in American history known as Presidential Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction, which was very lenient. Johnson favored a policy where Confederate states could quickly re-enter the Union having given up almost nothing. Secessionists, wealthy planters, and Confederate soldiers were given amnesty and simply had to swear a loyalty oath to the Union, which many of them did in person, in the White House, to Andrew Johnson personally. This guy here was more of a salt-of-the-earth, working-class kind of a guy, and he absolutely hated these rich planters. Hated them with a passion. But he was also a Southern person and had no conception whatsoever, really, of the implications of the Civil War for the newly emancipated slaves. As talented and as a strong capacity for growth that Abraham Lincoln had, and he did. He changed his mind several times between 1861 and 1865, when he was unfortunately assassinated Andrew Johnson was in many ways the exact opposite. He was a rigid, inflexible drunk. And he was a virulent racist. Even many Southerners of the time conceded that you had to at least admit that one of the consequences of the Civil War was that slavery was over. Okay? Lincoln had made it one of the conditions of the war. African Americans, some 200,000 just about, had fought in the Civil War to emancipate themselves. Okay? Johnson was not prepared to give them any civil rights at all. Okay? Now, he eventually came around to the idea of saying, okay, slavery's over. Okay, we can at least admit that. Now, one of the consequences of this, of course, is what? Johnson became the first president in American history to be impeached. And he survived removal from office by the Senate by one vote. Okay? After that, though, that pretty much ended the political career of Andrew Johnson. And a second period of Reconstruction policy, led by the legislative branch, by the House and Senate, known as Congressional Reconstruction, takes place. Okay? So Congress takes over Reconstruction policy. Certain things take place. One of them is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first civil rights law in American history, a law that I encourage you to study if you haven't already. You have various Reconstruction acts. One of them, of course, was the division of the South into military districts. Texas was in the 5th military district. You have black codes, the 14th and the 15th Amendments. What were the 14th and the 15th Amendments? The 14th in particular is cited a lot by people in the immigration debate. What was it? Anyone? Well, we know what the 13th Amendment did, right? What did the 13th Amendment to the American Constitution do? It ended slavery, right? The 14th Amendment did what? That's right. And it specifically states in the 14th Amendment that what? If you were born in the United States, even as a slave, you were what? You were a citizen of the United States. Remember, citizenship at this point in American history was not a federal question. This is the first time that you have a definition in American history of what an American citizen is. Okay? And then the 15th Amendment was about what? Voting rights. So, really, the post-war period is about what was going to be the meaning of freedom for this new country. The country had been devastated. Okay? Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. The bloodiest war in American history. A fundamental crushing of American life. Many communities lost half, especially in the South, half of their young men gone in the war. So, under Johnson's lenient Reconstruction, members of the federally required 1806 Constitutional Convention, each state, all the states, the southern states had constitutional conventions where they had to figure out what were going to be the conditions that would allow us to get back into the Union. And they had to do three things. One, repudiate the right of secession. Okay? Repudiate the right of secession. They had to ratify the 13th Amendment. They had to settle fairly and objectively the status, the social and political status of freedmen, and they had to repudiate the state's war debt. Now, this was not going to be acceptable to these former Confederates who were in charge of these legislatures. They simply were not going to accept this. This is J.W. Throckmorton, one of the leaders in Texas during this time period, former Confederate senator. And here's what they agreed to. They agreed to nullify secession, but not ab initio. Ab initio is this legal term which means from the beginning. If they had done that, what it would have meant is that everything that they did under the Confederacy would have been considered null and void. Remember I talked about Pease, how he wouldn't swear a loyalty oath to the Confederate government? If they had accepted this ab initio clause, that would have meant that their efforts to nullify Pease would have been considered null and void, because their secession would have been null and void. Everything the Confederacy would have done in those years would have been wiped out from the money that they printed, from the transactions that they engaged in with foreign governments, all of it would have been considered null and void. They would not accept the 13th Amendment. This was simply not going to be acceptable to people who fought a war premised on the idea that the black race was inferior to the white race and that the black race's natural position was in a state of subjugation to the white race. And they would not accept black suffrage. Absolutely. That's not even on the table. So what ended up happening? Well, Texas voters approved the Constitution, and they voted in this gentleman, Mr. Throckmorton, as the new governor, who defeated Elisha Pease, who was the moderate choice. Okay? And it was a landslide election. It was not close. Unlike Pease, who sat out the war quietly in Austin, Throckmorton served in the Confederate Army, in the 6th Texas Cavalry, and as Edmund Kirby Smith's Confederate Indian Commissioner. Now, Indian tribes, the history of Indian tribes and their role in the Civil War is also fascinating. I don't know if any of you know some of this history. There were some Indian tribes who fought with the Confederacy. For instance, the Cherokee Nation, a portion of the Cherokees fought for the Confederacy, and then there were some who fought for the Union. Pretty interesting history, but that would take us a little bit too far afield. Now, during the campaign at this time, in the mid-1860s, Pease, being the more rational, relaxed person that he was, and Sam Houston by this point had died, right? So Pease kind of rose, being the former governor that he was like Houston, although not a martial figure, an iconic figure like Houston. Nonetheless, Pease told the Texas delegates, he said, in voting in this man and engaging in your defiance, you are sowing the seeds of your own destruction. If you think you lost the war, you better watch out and wait what's going to happen if you people continue to act in this fashion. And he was proven correct, because what ends up happening is what I previously described as congressional reconstruction. And Texas becomes militarized. The U.S. Army comes in, removes these people, these Confederates from office, and says this is not going to be acceptable. The effort by ex-Confederates to act as if the Civil War had never happened wasn't going to work. I mean, the people from the North who had fought in that war, many of them wanted even harsher measures brought against the South and felt that this defiance was impertinent in the extreme. The so-called radicals in the Congress wanted to, some of them, completely subjugate the South. Like, we are going to put our boot on your neck and you're going to cry uncle and do exactly what we say because you lost. That was kind of the radical position. When the newly elected senators from Texas showed up in Congress in Washington to take their seats, they were not seated. They were kicked out. Oren Roberts, who was elected to the Senate in these years, he would not even take the test oath, the loyalty oath. Like, he was there to represent Texas in the Senate of the United States, but would not swear loyalty to the United States. Okay? So, of course, this was just not going to work. Now, of course, Oren Roberts was later elected governor of Texas. He would recover. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared African Americans to be citizens of the United States and gave the federal government the power to intervene on their behalf. This is the first time that you see this take place. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill happens, which extended the life of the Bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau, and there were plenty of branches that were established in many southern states, including Texas. And the Freedmen's Bureau had federal authority to nullify work agreements. It investigated violence against former slaves. One of the consequences of the Civil War was that, of course, planters now had to enter into work agreements with their formerly enslaved workforce. This was a foreign notion. It was an extremely complicated situation. Most of these slaves didn't even know what a contract was. They didn't know how to read and write. Some of these contracts, when you look at them, that are in the Freedmen's Bureau papers, the signature is an X. Okay? Pretty interesting stuff. Ultimately, a series of 3 Reconstruction Acts was passed, which ushers in the era of congressional Reconstruction. All of these laws were passed over President Johnson's veto. I already talked about how irrelevant President Johnson became. He was almost removed from office. The first Reconstruction Act, which was enacted in March of 1867, declared existing Southern governance to be provisional and of no legal standing, and divided the South into military districts. The act also clearly specified who could vote and laid out the terms and conditions under which the new state constitutions could be determined. Texas was in the 5th military district. You also had to accept the 13th and the 14th Amendment. This was not negotiable. Declaring him to be an impediment to Reconstruction, the military governor of Texas, General Philip Sheridan, removed Governor Throckmorton from office and replaced him with EMPs. And this is how EMPs got to be governor again of Texas in the 1860s. So let's talk a little bit about then this turbulent time in Texas history, what was going on. On Reconstruction matters, Pease aligned himself closely with Jack Hamilton. This is A.J. Hamilton, a representative in the Texas House from Travis County. His brother Morgan was part of the radical Reconstruction faction, which I'll talk about in Texas, which I'll talk about later. Morgan Hamilton, you all know about Hamilton Pool? This is that Hamilton, okay? His brother, Morgan Hamilton, okay? The Civil War Unionist, A.J. Hamilton was. He accepted the end of slavery and was appointed absentee governor by President Lincoln in 1862 during the Civil War. He was briefly appointed provisional governor. He initially supported black rights, including black suffrage, but he changed his mind, which had an impact on Pease. After a contentious battle, he lost the 1869 Republican nomination to E.J. Davis, Edmund J. Davis. And he became a vehement opponent of congressional Reconstruction and of Governor Davis, and ran for governor as an independent. And he basically engaged in a conspiracy alongside Pease to undermine the efforts of people such as Governor Davis to modernize the state of Texas. Pease did not really do a lot for black people. It was weak on civil rights. Pease administration was. It demonstrated reluctance to appoint blacks to political positions and dragged its feet on prosecuting white terrorists. There was extreme violence in places like Texas in these years, in the late 1860s and through the 1870s. This is when an organization founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest first makes its appearance. The organization is called the Ku Klux Klan, a white terrorist organization designed to keep newly emancipated slaves in a state of racial terror and subjugation. And Pease sat in his office in Austin and was very slow to listen to reports that were increasingly coming in from federal authorities and others about the extreme state of violence that was taking place, lynchings and other sorts of things. Following the disastrous Republican convention, Jack Hamilton decided to run against E.J. Davis for governor. Pease supported Hamilton. Remember, Pease's tenure as provisional governor was running out. There needed to be an election, and it was Hamilton versus Davis. It was an 1868-1869 Constitutional Convention. Hamilton, with Pease's assistance, declared his support for the proposed Constitution, including its universal suffrage provision, which would have restored the voting rights of former Confederates. This is important to understand. Former Confederates could not vote, but blacks could now, which is why the Republican Party was in charge in those years, right? You had members, black members of the Texas legislature for the first time. People like Shaq Roberts, right? George T. Ruby and others. Pease told black voters, basically, you need to shut up. You need to accept your place. Your former masters are going to come back into the Union, and you basically need to focus on self-help, and you will get the vote eventually, but not now. He specifically told black leaders, such as George T. Ruby, who was the head of the Union League in Texas, that was the Republican Party organ, that you can push this too far. And these people are not prepared to give you suffrage. Stop asking for it. Hamilton supported the system of segregated education that was in the Constitution. Matter of fact, he said it was good precisely because it was segregated. The principle being here what? Black and white children cannot be educated together. Hamilton, quote, said, "Our children would be insulted by being compelled to mix with other than their own color." Now, George T. Ruby called Hamilton untrustworthy and unprincipled, particularly when he would deny that there were black people being killed all over the state in lynchings and other forms of Klan terror. So what ends up happening is a schism within the Republican Party. You have the Radicals, which is a coalition of blacks who now can vote, many of whom were former slaves, and they're more or less progressive allies like Morgan Hamilton and E.J. Davis. And then you have the moderates, led by people such as E.M. Pease. So you have the radicals on one side and the moderates on the other side. Governor Pease and A.J. Hamilton led the moderate faction, with E.J. Davis, Morgan Hamilton, and George Ruby, and a coalition of Western Republicans. Western Republicans would be Republicans from places like Travis County, ab initio supporters, and most blacks. The moderates favored greater concessions to former Confederates, particularly on the ab initio issue and voting rights. And there was a hot political debate that took place against considerable anti-black violence in Texas. By the end of the convention, the 1868-1869 Constitutional Convention in Texas, which was supposed to produce a government that could go to the federal government and say, "We're ready to rejoin the Union," you really started to see some schisms being exposed. And you could see that the Pease-Hamilton faction were never going to support civil rights for blacks. They just weren't going to do it. After the end of the convention, Hamilton and Pease, they either started drifting away from the Republican Party and back to the Democratic Party. And in those days, the Democratic Party was what? It was the KKK party. That's where the Confederates were. Okay? Or they started engaging in strategic alliances with Democrats. So, they denied violence against blacks and other sorts of things. They said the Freedmen's Bureau agents that were in Texas were interlopers who were exaggerating the degree of violence that was taking place in Texas. It just wasn't as bad as people said, and in any case, these black people are inferior, and we can't give them voting rights now. In the meantime, we have things we need to do. We have a state that we need to reconstruct and an economy that we need to grow. So what happens? Well, Texas Republicans cannot agree on what to do. So it then falls upon the federal government to make a choice. President Grant was president by this point. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union Civil War hero. And the Texas general here, the military commander of Texas right here, General Reynolds, they sided with the E.J. Davis faction. And that's what results in Edmund J. Davis becoming then governor of the state of Texas. Democratic papers openly endorsed Hamilton and, quote, conservative Republicans. And they still wouldn't take the testimony. So it's not incorrect to say that the Pease-Hamilton faction, more or less, was allied with the Democratic faction to deny basic civil rights to blacks. His faction defeated on 30 December 1869, E.M. Pease resigns as provisional governor. He wasn't fired, he resigns. But he resigns because he knew he lost. He was going to be fired. In his letter of resignation, Pease stated that in his opinion, that the only mode of carrying out the policy of Congress to form a government for Texas was the election of Hamilton. He felt it couldn't happen under the leadership of Edmund J. Davis. By the way, Edmund J. Davis, if you go to the Texas State Cemetery, his is the largest monument, the largest mausoleum there. A fascinating person, Edmund Davis, a Union soldier from South Texas, who almost died in the Civil War. Most of the people buried in the Texas State Cemetery are Confederates, but there are some Unionists in the most ones. Under the existing circumstances, I am unwilling to become, says Pease, in any way responsible for the course being pursued by the military commander and the administration at Washington. So, you have radical Reconstruction people in power in Texas. What was the radical case? When I said earlier that people are confused about Reconstruction and what it was about, because, you have this ideology that you had scalawags and carpetbaggers, and then eventually government was redeemed and these other sorts of things. But what actually happened? I mean, I'm up here as a historian, and let's talk briefly about it. The Hamilton Pease faction did not take losing well. They charged the Davis and Ruby Republicans with being impractical malcontents who hated the people of Texas. This is George T. Ruby, by the way, one of the first African Americans in the Texas legislature. Governor Davis pointed out that this ab initio controversy that these people were fixated on was largely their own fault. He pointed out that most of them had been in favor of it at some point, when they felt it was to their strategic advantage. He also stated his interpretation of the true differences between the two factions. He said it was dollars and cents. Davis and his supporters wanted to force the return of monies to the school fund that had been taken out by Confederates during the war. They used that money to fight the war. And public education was one of the most pressing needs that post-Civil War Reconstruction society was going to require. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Indeed, in 1870 and 71, Davis and the 12th legislature passed laws making public schooling free and compulsory for the first time in Texas history. It hadn't been that way before. You probably aren't told this much, but what's known as the free and common school in America today is an outgrowth of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That was the first time, especially in the South, you had what is known as the free and common school for everybody. In 1877, Texas led the nation in miles of track built, and the following year, more track was laid in Texas than in all other states combined. And then here's some other things. I'm going to move along here because I want us to have some robust discussion later. And what essentially happened is that the Pease-Hamilton faction engaged in an endless series of ad hominem attacks against the radical Reconstructionists. Does this sound familiar to our current politics today? The Davis government was largely brought down by the issue of taxation. Who was going to pay for these public improvements? Now, let's talk a little bit about this here. The Constitution of the state of West Texas. You all know about this? No? This is one of the most interesting documents in Texas history. You all know, of course, about the difference between the state of Virginia and the state of West Virginia, right? Well, guess what? It almost happened here. It was written in 1868 and was introduced at the Constitutional Convention of 1869. It was proposed as one of the solutions for this inability of the Republican Party to establish a government in Texas at the time. And what it would have proposed is this. It would have split Texas up. And East Texas, basically, from Texas A&M eastward. Okay, I don't want to go there. But basically, East Texas, from that area eastward, points east, would have been the state of Texas. And then there would have been a new state formed called the state of West Texas, and its capital would have been Austin. Austin would have been the capital of the state of West Texas. Never happened. It was introduced in Congress of the United States. Matter of fact, Thaddeus Stevens read it aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives, but it never got out. So let's talk a little bit about the Pease legacy. E.M. Pease was in the vanguard of these Lone Star Yankees who established themselves as merchants, lawyers, and business people and politicians. I've already mentioned them to you, some of these people. In terms of their racial attitudes, these people varied, and they were to a certain extent somewhat conflicted. But they only vary in minor details. The long and short of it is that these northern men, when they came to the South to make their money, fairly quickly adopted racial attitudes that were Southern in nature. You see this when it has parallels in other southern states, in South Carolina, for instance. Okay. Remember, the North, especially New York City, was the merchant capital of the United States. And where was the cotton coming from? Southern states. And who were the intermediaries? Men like Pease and William Marshall Pease. This is why New York City almost seceded from the Union with southern states prior to the Civil War. Did you all know that? It's true. Look it up. Pease's ultimate political ambition was the United States Senate. This would have been the crowning achievement of his political career. It would have pleased his relations in New England and Wisconsin greatly had he achieved that position, but circumstances around him simply prevented it. And quite frankly, Pease was not talented enough as a politician to accomplish this. By the way, during his lifetime, Pease was not known as Elisha. Everybody called him Marshall. That was his name. Marshall Pease. So, but you know, it was something that he wanted to really explore. So let's briefly take a look at some of the discussions that he engaged in with his friend Guy Bryan. Guy Bryan, of course, a famous person in Texas history, Peach Point Plantation, among other things. Stephen, close relative to Stephen F. Austin. And in the lead up to the Civil War, an exchange takes place. And we have this correspondence now, so it's really fascinating because it sheds important light into how politics at this time between northern and southern elements in Texas were moving. An apprehension is in place, says Bryan, that you are not sufficiently southern in feelings. Confidence in the perpetuity of the Union is fast leaving the southern mind. You need to show up your credentials, Marshall Pease, as a true southern man. Bryan told Pease to use his, quote, best feeling and conviction to, quote, discuss his long residence in the South, your interest in being here, your children born here, etc., etc. More to the point, Bryan asked Pease to write him boldly and truthfully his real view and feelings upon the Southern question in state rights. He specifically asked Pease the following questions. How you looked upon the question of the respective powers of the states and the general government. Whether he considered slavery right in itself or only a necessary evil. This was an important thing. A lot of Northerners who were in the South, that's one of the ways in which they made themselves comfortable with slavery. Matter of fact, to a certain extent, that applies to Stephen F. Austin himself, who was generally an enlightened man, but who is the single person most responsible for establishing slavery and perpetuating the institution in Mason, Texas. And then, what would his course be if a, quote, black Republican got elected in 1860? And that, of course, did happen. Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860 with no Southern support. Pease was taken aback. He replied, quote, my past history is not a sufficient guarantee of the soundness of my views on the great question of slavery. It would be idle for me to make any such public declaration. Pease reminded Bryan that in March 1836, during the Revolutionary period in Texas history, before he had owned any slaves, when he was 24 years old, he had written the clause in the Constitution of the Republic of Texas legalizing slavery. Article 9, Sections 2 and 3. So there you have it. Now you know. E.M. Pease, the guy with the mansion over there in Old Enfield in Austin, Texas, he's the guy who wrote that stuff in the Texas Constitution. And he had urged its adoption by the convention. This is a northern man who had been in Texas for less than a year. Pease wrote that he had no qualms about slavery, else he wouldn't own any slaves himself. In response to the third question, Pease wrote that the election of a Republican president would be, quote, one of the greatest evils that could come before the country, so forth and so on. But these proclamations were not sufficient to the Southern chivalric mind that is described earlier. Pease, regardless of his protestations, at the time at least, was considered to be a northern man. And he could say that he was pro-slavery all he wanted, but he wasn't, a Southern slaveholder in that East Texas tradition. It's different being a planter, having a plantation, hiring overseers, and having to deal with the violence that slavery entails. It's another thing being a lawyer for those people. And that's what Pease was. He was their lawyer. Moreover, Southern observers of this issue saw what was happening with Pease's mentors and associates up north in Enfield and in Connecticut. Gideon Wells and Niles, they were abolitionists now. Okay? Abolitionism had gathered steam and force in the intervening years. Pease was certainly never an abolitionist. Okay? But nonetheless, Southerners, they felt that they needed some assurances beyond what Pease gave. And one of the reasons that Pease was not going to get elected to the Senate from Texas was when I mentioned this earlier about him not being necessarily a talented orator or not having the talent, is that he wasn't a good public speaker. He often relied on others. That's one of the reasons he lost the 1851 gubernatorial race. He was very good at doing the legal work, like writing briefs. He was good at writing laws, things of this nature. But Pease was a stutterer, which, if you're a politician or a radio host, probably is going to make it difficult for you to try to have a political career, especially in the 19th century when oratorical skills and being able to speak from the stump were all important. This is in the days before radio and these kinds of things, mass media. He was also somewhat of an unsure-footed politician. He had this northern tendency to over-philosophize, okay? That's another thing that made people, including his southern clients and friends, uneasy about Pease. He thought too damn much. He wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool, fire-breathing southern hater of of the North, okay? He also, Pease did some things on the policy end that also infuriated some people. He put the brakes on some railroad speculation ventures, the early ones in the 1850s, although he adjusted his politics after that. And he had a more deeper sense, a Yankee sense of the common good than a typical Southern planter did. Pease did embrace fiscal conservatism, okay? His planter friends were fiscal conservatives in that anachronistic, old-school agrarian way. Pease was an acceptor of the idea that limited expenditure of the public purse was acceptable, especially for things such as infrastructure, public education, transportation, and so forth, or water conservation, which I guess you all just heard about. Pease did remain a committed segregationist. His post-war racial attitudes were basically those of a benevolent paternalist. And these are Yankee notions. It's not unusual. And they have grafted themselves, though, on the DNA of Austin. And Austin's reputation as sort of a liberal utopia within Texas, that strand of Yankee racism persists to the present in this city. Pease did not believe in political and social equality for black people. He simply could not conceive of a black person occupying a position as high or greater than him. And that's illustrated in a gazillion different ways, especially during his brief tenure as collector of customs from Balancing. On issues such as slavery and convict leasing, Pease's actions were essentially Southern. And it is kind of interesting that it was a Northern man that not only ensconced slavery in the Texas Constitution, but also put into our practices politically the system of convict leasing, which, of course, is one of the most horrific chapters in racial history of Texas. Unlike Edmund J. Davis, Pease was not usually considered a scalawag politician during the Reconstruction years. The first general history of Reconstruction in Texas was by a gentleman named Charles Ramsdale. It's in that Dunning school, the birth of a nation gone with the wind school that accepts this idea that Reconstruction was this horrific period of Negro misrule, where you had scalawag and carpetbagger white politicians who destroyed Southern governments and the Southern way of life, and then the government was redeemed by former Confederate officers, and they was the conventional school of Reconstruction historiography for most of the 20th century. Now let's talk a little bit about what Pease did in the 1870s after more or less redemption took place. Pease changed course when it became apparent that Northern money was going to be coming here, and that was going to be something that was going to be a feature of Reconstructed governments in the South, particularly when it came to railroads, and especially after oil was discovered in Texas. In 1877, Pease became associated with the Brackenridges and did the First National Bank. Pease was vice president of that bank. And he used his position as a Northern man in the autumn of his life to again become one of the cities and the state's leading industrialists. He allowed Northern capital from New York and New England, for much of which he had familial connections, to come here and help reconstruct the state of Texas. So he knew that it was going to be money, Wall Street money and elsewhere from New York, that was going to be financing the railroads. He did not favor giving away public land to these, to what he considered to be money-grubbing, speculative railroad corporations. But by the 1870s, he changed his mind, because he knew that that's the way government was moving. And he made a mostly smooth transition. He became an elder statesman and intermediary, and Pease became a founder of the Austin Chamber of Commerce in the 1870s. He, of course, deeded land in 1875 for Pease Park. And he was one of the founders, served on the first board of the Tillotson Normal and Collegiate Institute in 1877, which is today's Houston-Tillotson University. The Tillotson in Houston-Tillotson, of course, refers to a preacher from Wethersfield, Connecticut, named Reverend George Jeffrey Tillotson. And it's the oldest college for African Americans west of the Mississippi River. I'm going to skip this because I'm going to need to wrap it up here in a minute. This is a book here called The Conquest of Texas. Pease's Indian policies, especially during his tenure as governor, are very interesting. But I don't have time to get into it right now. So, many of the Lone Star Yankees were appreciators of history as well as the arts, and they helped establish a bunch of historical and learned societies because they saw themselves as history makers. So Ashbel Smith organized the Texas Historical Society in Houston in 1870, which is a precursor to today's Texas State Historical Association. Julia Pease, who was one of E.M. Pease's daughters, was a founder of that association and was a primary sponsor of Elizabeth Ney, of the Elizabeth Ney museum that we have here now. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the random signs of similarity and hybridity. Who here watches Downton Abbey? Ah, I knew you would. Right there, you're proving to me why there is a Yankee influence in places like Austin, Texas, because other than Boston, Massachusetts, and Seattle, Washington, Austin, Texas is the third biggest place for that show on PBS.